Part 20 of X, There Was a Man, the Saga of Gordon Kahl, a True Story. Page 187, Chapter 26, Betrayal. Grandpa had been able to keep his spirits high under the circumstances until mid-May, when the pressures began to demoralize him. He thought of Joan and Yori currently being tried in Fargo, along with his friends David Brower and Scott Fall. He pondered the travesty, thinking, with all that silly courtroom security, any jury would convict the judge. And now that I mention it, they ought to. In that court, they don't stand a chance. By late May, the verdicts were rendered and Grandpa became both despondent and morose. On Memorial Day, Leonard and Norma Ginter came by the Russell residence during the morning. Grandpa said, "I want to go home with you." "You can't," replied Leonard. "I've got to. The Federals are closing in," retorted Grandpa, whose intuition was always fairly reliable and a mystery to those who knew him. Leonard Ginter was a retired carpenter who departed Wisconsin 6 or 8 years earlier for the Ozarks, partly to escape that state's higher taxes. His only income was a VA insurance benefit of $166 per month, owing from the death of his son in the Vietnam conflict. He lived in a trailer for a while and then made a gentleman's lease agreement with Bill Wade to construct a home on Bill's farm, halfway between Smithville and Imboden. He then built an earthen home of concrete covered on 3 sides on top by dirt to conserve energy. The only wood in the building was for cross partitions, cabinets, and doors. The long center partition was concrete. The back rooms were vented through a single roof vent. A 2-story garage was attached to the west end of the building. Leonard's son had lived in another house nearby and across the creek in the same vale for a while. The place was located about 2 miles from the state road connecting the two towns. He sank all of his life savings into that house, containing everything he owned. Leonard backed his cream-colored Omni to the house and loaded Grandpa and his meager possessions, including a shotgun and a Mini 14. Ed Udy was also at Russell's on that morning. Karen had noticed the 2 vehicles before she left the house that day. When she returned, both cars and Grandpa were gone. The enticing reward money loomed large on her mind. She was tired of being broke. The next day, she provided the government with a long, sought-after lead. Karen drove to the Easy Mart on Highway 5 South and called the FBI in Little Rock, telling them she knew where Gordon Kahl had been. For this and her subsequent cooperation, she received $1,196 for interim expenses plus $25,000 reward money, and was granted immunity from prosecution. Grandpa had told her earlier that the reward for him was the highest ever offered. It was not tax-free. Karen was told to stand by, and the FBI agent Jack Knox of Fayetteville called her back a few minutes later. They arranged a meeting in Montana home for the next evening, June 1st, and in discussing possible code names for the agent, Karen suggested Fort Knox. Whether this was prompted by his last name or a way to get the gold needed for her school ambitions is open to conjecture. They met in a park at the appointed time. The interview was taped. She told him all she knew about the events of the past 3 months. He told her about the reward, which might be as much as $10,000 or $15,000. She volunteered to be an undercover agent of sorts, play along with these people and keep the Bureau informed. He gave her some expense money. She pushed for immunity from prosecution for her father, but was told they didn't know whether they could do that or not. The two discarded the Fort Knox code name, and maybe because it sounded a bit mercenary. Agent Knox pressured her to help determine the location of Grandpa, who was to be killed in cold blood within 48 hours. For the next 18 days, Karen continued to live with her father as requested by the FBI. She gave them evidence of Grandpa's having been there. She This included a handkerchief purported to be his, the book she had lent him, and 2 other documents for fingerprint analysis. One of these was a drawing of the beast from Revelation. His fingerprints were later to be found on a prune juice jar obtained in a search of the house. As a result of Karen's betrayal and testimony, 5 people were to be charged in federal court with harboring a fugitive and for conspiring to do so. As Clarence Darrow had stated years ago, stealing a dime is no big deal, but conspiring to do so can get you 20 years. Irene Udy was finally acquitted by the judge for lack of evidence, with the most paltry of evidence. Reverend Edwin Udy, at age 72, was found guilty and later sent to prison for 5 years. Evidently, Karen's intercession on behalf of her father had results. The judge, remarking that Art was the kind of person one would want for a grandfather, meted out a 6-month sentence at a low-security institution in Texarkana. Art, who was 74, later remarked, "By cracky, I'll tell you, it was not a correctional prison. It was an educational institution. They meant to teach you that they were the boss." Leonard Ginter got 8 years and was sent to a prison in Oklahoma. The incarceration of Norma Ginter was commuted to time served in jail. About 3 weeks after Grandpa had left, Art came home to find Karen extremely upset. "I'm scared to death," Karen said. "They brought a subpoena to me to appear at the grand jury." Art tried to console her and said, "I'll bet they have one for me too." Karen admitted that this was so, and Art made arrangements to get the subpoena from the federal authorities, who sought to avoid coming onto his premises. Art's was a false summons, as no one desired for him to appear before the grand jury. As Lord Acton said, "The struggle for liberty is the struggle to contain government power." This despicable use of a false subpoena goes to show the pits to which the noble grand jury institution has sunk in present-day America. Pure fraud by the government agents, shades of Magna Carta. "I'm sorry to do it this way," said Agent Cox, "but you're under arrest, and this is the only way I could take you into custody without a risk." On that same day, and after Art had left home, FBI agent Richard Brazel and others searched Art's place. Besides taking his diary, Patriot literature, prune juice jars, and other items, they stole his cache of silver in the name of the federal government. We couldn't just leave it there unguarded. Nothing in the search warrant allowed such confiscation. Art was not permitted to use this for bail bonds. In fact, he never got the silver back, but has taken legal action to obtain payment. Like I said before, if he should ever get compensated, most of it will go for lawyers' fees and other legal expenses. When Art was arrested, the FBI placed Karen in the Witness Protection Program. She and her daughters were moved, first to Fayetteville and then elsewhere under an assumed name. She lacked 2 months of an English course when she quit high school and said that she wanted to get a GED and go to college. Her relatives did not know where she is, except possibly her ex-husband Mike, who has visitation rights with the children. Art has expressed his contempt for the government action, averring that Karen is not and never was in any danger. They, the Federals, mistakenly attach their morals and values to people like me and my friends. The whole thing is silly and ridiculous. Christians don't operate like the mafia. Art is concerned about her after her reward money is spent. Everyone knows that the state government steal people's kids all the time under the guise of child welfare, but it seems to me that the Federals have stolen Art's grandchildren. As the psalmist said, "The wicked freely strut about when what is vile is honored among men." Psalms 12:8. I think when governments interfere with people's lives, regardless of how noble their intentions, they are apt to do more harm than good. Beware of any government employee who is going to do you good. Chapter 27, Pursuit. Leonard Ginter and his wife Norma lived in their earth home, about 4 miles out of town. Their home was in the rolling foothills, a long mile off State Highway 115, following up on Karen's lead. The FBI verified that Leonard's Omni had been in Smithville on Memorial Day afternoon. The chief FBI agent, James T. Blassingame of Little Rock office, took charge of the search. A light observation airplane was utilized for Agents Downing and Blasingame intermittently to fly over a lazily circle the Ginter residence, joining the field hawks in search of prey. They spotted Leonard's car, and on one occasion saw two people outside the house. This was on June the 2nd. The car was registered to the Life Science Church. Leonard warned Grandpa about the flyovers that it was probably the Federals. However, he seemed apathetic, tired of running, and unconcerned. News of the Fargo trial outcome had made him despondent. After settling down in one of the bedrooms, he passed the time by going for walks in the surrounding woods and sometimes watching television. Maybe he really wanted the Lord to call him home, what the psychologist would call a death wish. He seemed uninterested in relocating elsewhere, even though Ginter residence had only one entrance. It is interesting to note that he had done nothing to alter his appearance since leaving North Dakota. No toupee, no mustache, nothing. He simply was not prone to deception. To be forewarned, as the airplane surveillance provided, was to be forearmed. If Grandpa were inclined to do so, he was not. To get to the Ginter house, a vehicle must travel for a mile or so down a one-lane gravel road, heavily fenced on both sides, then turn right for half a mile, similarly fenced up and down the hills. It would be extremely dangerous for any armed aggressor to invade such territory. If apt defenders were inclined to keep a vigil and use armed resistance, but this is exactly what the FBI was to plan to do. Blasingame began making plans for an armed task force search of the Ginter property. It was to be coordinated and joint effort of the FBI, the Marshal's Office, the State Police, and the Lawrence County Sheriff's Department, including civilian posse members. SWAT teams of both the FBI and the Marshal Service were to be included. Sheriff Gene Matthews was to be notified and involved in both the planning and execution of the search, because failure to do so would risk years of ill feeling and non-cooperation with federal authorities in the area, according to Blasingame. Another reason was that Matthews knew the area and the people. The fiasco to come was the worst and most inexcusable task force snafu in Arkansas since FBI agent Milton Purvis and team assaulted the Machine Gun Kelly gang. That happened on Grandpa's birthday one frosty January dawn over half a century ago at a rural residence in Pulaski County near Little Rock. Copious blood was spilled foolishly on both sides during the ensuing shootout, which might have been avoided. George Kelly, his mole, and another escaped with a suitcase of stolen money during the firefight. Local lawmen had been relegated to a distant backup role in the raid. One of Kelly's captured friends then told Purvis where George was headed. In this instance, when Purvis encountered him a few days later in a Memphis hotel, the notorious gangster was arrested, not killed. Kelly later originated the term G-Man. A decision early on must have been made not to attempt to obtain a federal search warrant. This was evidently because of the uncertainty of getting one, a lack of probable cause. A federal magistrate might not accept an FBI affidavit that Informant X told Agent Y that Gordon Kahl was seen traveling with Leonard Ginter in a cream-colored 1980 Dodge Omni. Leonard Ginter was at the Russell residence at Mountain Home. To be probable cause for a search of Ginter's house, Karen had only said a cream-colored compact car was at the house. Maybe Grandpa's position and the government agents tell lies has some merit. There's nothing to compare with prevarications to follow later. An agent later testified in court that in all his years of service, he had never known of a federal warrant being obtained through a state or local office, but a state warrant was obtained from Larry Hayes in Walnut Ridge on June 3rd, which was not shown to the Ginters until a week after their house was torched. The warrant had dubious validity since Mr. Hayes wore several hats, part-time jobs. One of these was being city attorney for Walnut Ridge, a prosecutorial function. Warrants are legally issued by nonpartisan judiciary members only. Ostensibly, because higher judicial officers were not available. This municipal judge for Hoxie, who was also the juvenile judge for Lawrence County, was to be used. I was called by Mr. Stallcup. I went down to his office, and there were some people at his office. They had a warrant. I looked at it and I signed it. Something was said about someone's life being in danger, testified Larry Hayes in court. That happened after lunch on June the 3rd. James Stallcup is the prosecutor for Lawrence County, thought by some to be politically ambitious. Some citizens aver that bad blood exists between Stallcup and Gene Matthews. They allege that a few days earlier Stallcup had gone to the sheriff's office and was trying to tell Matthews how to run his department. The ensuing argument ended, it is said, by the robust Matthews decking Stallcup and threatening to kill him if he returned. Sheriff Matthews, serving his second term as sheriff, had his share of tragedy and personal problems. He was divorced. During the preceding summer, he was visiting a physician's home where his small son could swim in a pool. His son drowned, but survived, but has since been totally incapacitated. On the job, Sheriff Matthews was known as a take-charge sort of guy. His funeral was to be heavily attended within a few days at Walnut Ridge. The plan was to have Blasingame in charge. If his Arkansas assignment was not the FBI's relegation of him to Dogpatch and Bureau exile to Lower Slobovia, the snafu of the search operation to come certainly justified it. His subsequent retirement from the FBI at a relatively young age in 1985 may have been related to those events of June the 3rd, 1983, the civil lawsuits arising therefrom. His plan was for a motorcade of armed law enforcement officers to drive to the Ginner residence. The bullhorn on the vehicle was to be used to call everyone out of the home. One separate team was to approach the house by a trek through the woods from the highway. Lawmen armed with automatic weapons and shotguns traveling in the convoy would surround the house. A roadblock would be established at the highway. No portable Bull Run would be carried, believing it was unnecessary. This time the Federals would have the machine guns. The motorcade arrived at the Ginner residence about 5:50 on the afternoon. Events did not go according to plan, starting with the separate SWAT team getting lost in the woods. Marshal Kupferer, the head of the fugitive apprehension, who was active in North Dakota search, was en route from Washington. Perplexingly, this high-ranking Justice Department official, who arrived at a botched scene a couple of hours later, did not take command of the operation, leaving Blasingame in charge. All right, we will start the next part with Chapter 28, Manslaughter.